Chapter 7. The Fall of Rome and the Birth of Feudalism. 1. The burden of Roman taxes on free farmers. The decline of Roman Empire wasn't merely collapsing frontiers and invading hordes. It was an internal economic implosion, driven by a fiscal regime that had become parasitic. By the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, the Roman state had transformed into a massive machine of extraction. To maintain a bloated bureaucracy, a decadent imperial court, and a mercenary army stationed on thousands of miles of frontier, the empire required an astronomical amount of gold. The primary victim of this desperation? The last remaining class of independent property owners, the free rural farmers. The Roman tax system, the annona and the capitatio jugatio, became a giant hydraulic engine that sucked the lifeblood out of the provinces. Taxes were no longer a contribution to the common good. They were a death sentence. The state demanded payment in gold or silver, solidus, commodities that the small-scale farmer, who lived in a world of subsistence and local barter, simply didn't have. To meet these demands, the farmer was forced to sell his seed grain, or more fatally, borrow from the local senatorial aristocracy at usurious interest rates. The physical landscape of the late empire reflected this despair. Walk through the Italian or Gallic countryside, you'd see abandoned farmsteads, agri deserti. Farmers, unable to pay the crushing tribute of blood and gold, simply fled their land, preferring the life of a forest outlaw, the Bagaudai, to the slow starvation of free ownership. Property had become a liability. In the eyes of Roman law, the land was a taxable unit first and a source of life second. If the farmer couldn't produce the tax, the state empowered the tax collector to seize not just the crops, but the tools, the livestock, and eventually the family itself. This fiscal terror created a voluntary surrender of property that laid the foundations for the Middle Ages. Desperate to escape the state's tax collectors, often the local town councilors, curiales, personally liable for any shortfall, the free farmers turned to the only power capable of defying the central government, the great local landlords. In a process known as patrocinium, the small farmer would gift his land to the powerful lord in exchange for protection. The farmer remained on the soil, but he was no longer its owner. He was a colonus. He had traded his legal dominium for the lord's shadow, hoping that the lord's private army would keep the state's tax gatherers at bay. This was the moment the public state died and private lordship was born. The burden of taxes had turned the Roman citizen into a fugitive on his own land, transforming the vibrant landscape of independent owners into a silent world of masters and dependents. The freedom of property had been taxed out of existence, leaving behind only the cold, hard structures of what would soon be called feudalism. 2. The transition from war leadership to hereditary royalty. The collapse of Roman civil authority didn't merely leave a power vacuum. It fundamentally altered the source of legitimacy for property and power. Look at the forest-dwelling Germanic tribes before they crossed the Rhine. In their original state, leadership was a functional necessity, not a property right. The leader was a herzog, literally a poler of the army. He was elected by the assembly of free men, the thing, specifically for a campaign. His authority was moral and tactical. He didn't own the tribe, nor did he own the land they walked upon. When the war ended, his extraordinary powers dissolved back into the communal body of the gens. However, as these tribes occupied the vast sedentary Roman provinces, the war leader was forced to become a land administrator. The temporary commander evolved into the rex, the king. This wasn't a mere change in title, it was a revolution in the concept of the public domain. As the Germanic tribes seized the Roman fiscus, the emperor's private lands, and the ager publicus, state lands, a terrifying new legal fiction emerged. The king began to claim that he was not just the leader of the people, but the ultimate owner of the soil. This shift from leader of men to owner of the land was the birth of hereditary royalty. In the old tribal world, the land belonged to the gens through blood right. In the new Roman-Germanic synthesis, the land was viewed as the king's personal patrimony. The king, to secure his fragile position, needed a permanent circle of loyalists. He began to grant portions of his newly claimed royal land to his most faithful companions, comitatus, in exchange for their continued military service. These grants, initially called beneficia, benefits, were at first temporary, revocable if the warrior failed his duty. However, the logic of the hearth soon took over. A warrior who had spent his life improving a manor and defending a valley wanted his son to inherit it. Through a series of slow, often violent negotiations, these temporary grants became hereditary fiefs. The king's word became the new title deed. The ancient communal equality of the kinsman died in this transition. The land was no longer held by the people through birth. It was held by the nobility through fealty to the king. The king was now the landlord-in-chief, dominus terrae. The crown was no longer placed on the head of the bravest warrior by the shout of the assembly. It was passed from father to son like a piece of valuable furniture or a private estate. The kingdom itself became a piece of property that could be divided among heirs or given as dowry. By the time the Carolingian era reached its peak, the democratic war leadership of the Old World had been entirely swallowed by landed royalty. The soil of the nation had become a private family inheritance, and the free tribesman had been transformed into a subject of the crown. 3. Public land theft and the rise of the nobility. The transformation of Europe during the early medieval period wasn't merely a change of government. It was a violent, structural decapitation of the ancient communal world. This process is best described as the systematic theft of the public land, a centuries-long campaign where the rising military aristocracy forcibly converted the almond, the everyman's land, into the private manor. This was the moment when the commoner was stripped of his ancestral inheritance, turning the landscape of freedom into a prison of boundaries. In the original Germanic mark system, the world was a shared sanctuary. The vast, dark forests were not owned by individuals. They were the collective pantry and storehouse of the gens. The marshes were a source of peat and reeds. The rolling pastures were the common lungs of the village, where any man's cattle could roam without a fence in sight. This communal resource was the only thing that allowed a small farmer to remain independent. However, as the feudal nobility rose, they utilized their monopoly on heavy cavalry and stone fortifications to enclose the wild. They didn't just claim the land, they stole the horizon. Imagine the scene. A village that for generations had gathered its winter firewood from a nearby ancient oak grove suddenly finds the path blocked by armed men-at-arms. A forest law is proclaimed, decreeing that the trees now belong to the Lord's forest. Silva regis. To cut a branch is now theft. To hunt a deer is now poaching, punishable by death or blinding. This was an act of economic strangulation. By seizing the forests and pastures, the nobility made it impossible for a free man to survive. A peasant might own a small patch of soil, but without the commons to provide fuel for his hearth and grass for his plow ox, his independence withered. This extra economic force created an artificial poverty. The nobility didn't need to chain the peasant to a post. They simply fenced off the resources he needed to stay alive. Faced with the choice between starvation and servitude, the free man was forced to walk to the newly built stone castle on the hill. In a ceremony of commendation, he would kneel before the Lord, placing his hands within the Lord's hands, and surrender his remaining plot of land in exchange for protection and the right to use the very woods his grandfather had owned by birthright. The rise of the nobility was thus not a product of superior farming or saving capital, but a product of domestic colonization. By the 11th century, the free horizons of the tribal era had been fractured by stone walls and no trespassing signs enforced by the sword. The gens had been replaced by the manor, and the shared heritage of the tribe had become the private dominium of a few hundred warrior families. This theft was the primary accumulation of feudal power, turning the earth into a private asset and its inhabitants into its tenants. 4. The role of landsknecht, mercenaries, in power shifts. As the ancient communal structures of Europe were dismantled, and the concentration of property moved into the hands of a warrior elite, a new and formidable figure emerged to police this new order: the landsknecht, the professional mercenary. This wasn't merely a change in military tactics, it was a profound economic shift. The rise of the mercenary marked the moment when the defense of property was no longer a shared civic duty of the community, but a specialized commodity bought by the highest bidder. In the old Germanic mark, every free man was a soldier because every free man was a stakeholder in the common soil. He fought to defend the tribe's forest and pasture because they were his own lifeblood. However, as the nobility stole the horizon through violent enclosures, they created a massive class of dispossessed men. These were peasants whose families had lost their ancient rights to the common lands, men who had been freed from the soil only to find themselves with no way to fill their bellies. Having been stripped of their property, they sold the only thing they had left: their capacity for cold, efficient violence. The landsknecht became the iron fist of the new property owners. A lord who has alienated his own people through land theft cannot rely on a peasant militia to protect his borders. He needs a class of men whose only loyalty is to the paymaster's purse. These mercenaries were the essential tools for the further expansion of feudal estates. They were used to crush peasant jacqueries, rebellions, and to enforce the new forest laws against those who still tried to forage in the woods that had once been theirs. To the landsknecht, the land was not a home or a sacred heritage. It was a theater of war, where property boundaries were drawn in blood. This professionalization of violence created a lethal feedback loop of property accumulation. Only the wealthiest lords, those who had already seized vast tracts of land, could afford to maintain these private armies. With these mercenaries, they could bully smaller landowners and seize even more communal meadows, which in turn provided the rents and taxes necessary to hire even more soldiers. The landsknecht were the midwives of the feudal state. They provided the extra economic force needed to ensure that the new private titles were respected. The mercenary was the physical proof that property had transitioned from a social right to a military command, where the length of the sword determined the depth of the master's domain. 5. From status to contract, the early shifts in legal bonds. We conclude this era of upheaval by examining the profound mutation in the human legal soul, the shift from status to contract. This transition represents the final step in the desacralization of the earth and the ultimate solidification of the feudal order. In the ancient tribal world, your relationship to the land was determined by your status, who you were by blood. You were a member of the gens, a kinsman of the tribe, and therefore you possessed an inalienable right to a share of the communal heritage. You didn't sign for your land, you were born into it. It was an organic, religious, and ancestral bond that no one could take away, because it was part of your very identity as a human being. But in the emerging feudal world, this organic bond was replaced by a contractual one, though it was often a contract made under the shadow of a spear. Under the feudal system, the land was no longer a natural right, but a conditional grant. A knight held his land on the condition of providing 40 days of military service. A serf held his small strip of soil on the condition of working 3 days a week on the lord's personal fields. Everything was now a deal, a bargain, a lease on life. This shift fundamentally changed the nature of the earth. The land was no longer the mother of the tribe. It was a tenement to be managed through a chain of duties. The feudal chain of being was a pyramid of contracts that stretched from the lowest plowman to the king.
While this introduced a more structured, documented legal world, it permanently erased the concept of the common from Western law. Every piece of ground was now bound by a string of private obligations and rents. The move from status to contract meant that the shared world was gone. It had been replaced by a world of negotiated servitude, where the only way to have a place on the earth was to sign away your labor to those who owned the horizon.